excited to bring to you today my guest, who is Dr. Hanaway, who is a board-certified physician from Washington University. Dr. Hanaway served on the executive committee for the American Board of Integrative Medicine and is past president of the American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine. For the past 20 years, he has worked with his wife in clinical practice at Family to Family. After 10 years as Chief Medical Officer at Genova Diagnostics, Dr. Hanaway became the Chief Medical Education Officer at the Institute for Functional Medicine, where he oversaw the development and implementation of IFM's programs worldwide, and he is currently also leading the COVID task force at IFM. In 2018, Dr. Hanaway was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. We talk about his functional medicine and integrative approach to healing, how he also used a ketogenic approach during chemotherapy. Recent medical assessments now also show no evidence of disease. Dr. Hanaway has been initiated as a Maracame shaman by the Huichol people in the Sierra Madres in Mexico. He holds community fires, leads ceremonies, and also offers traditional healing sessions. Dr. Hanaway is an absolute thought leader in the realm of functional medicine. And for those who are not too familiar with functional medicine, oftentimes you will hear people in the wellness industry recommend seeing functional medicine doctors as a way to look for the root causes of disease. So we really dive deep into various topics such as gut health, what is functional medicine, protocols after taking antibiotics, the difference in sequencing when it comes to stool testing, how getting in touch with nature promotes greater microbiome diversity, and much more. It was a deeply personal conversation, and I'm really grateful to everything that Dr. Hanaway has shared with us today, and so I hope you enjoy the episode. As usual, all resources will be also available in the show notes. First of all, I'm really excited and honored to have the time to be able to have a chat with you today, and really thank you so much for taking the time. I think it would be great to start with, for those who are not too familiar, what is functional medicine? And what are some aspects that make it unique from conventional medicine?
Well, functional medicine is an interesting term. It's one that, we're looking at the overall function of the body. Instead of looking at the organ systems, the heart, the lungs, the skin, the gut, we're looking at the functions. So we find that functions work in all of our lives. So, for example, whether it's working on my body or an individual organ or an individual cell or my family, my community, my state, there has to be a way to assimilate, to gather what is needed, the nutrients, whether it's food, water, light, love, all these aspects. So there's that idea of that function of gathering assimilation. There's a function of getting detoxification, of getting rid of that which is not needed. Taking the excess and having a way to do that. There's a need for a defense and repair, whether we call it the immune system or we call it the police force or the military, that's helping to keep order in things. We have a need for energy production, whether that's the mitochondria, the 1,000 mitochondria inside the cardiac cell, or it's a power plant, whether it's, solar or nuclear or oil powered. All those are ways to be able to produce energy. So these are the functions that we call functional medicine. It sits within a systems view. So what we're doing is we're looking to understand what is the root cause that is going on for an individual. Those root causes may be intrinsic, related to my own lifestyle factors, nutrition, sleep, exercise, how we deal with stress, what our relationships and connections are, or they may be extrinsic. They may be due to some hidden infections or due to antigens and allergens in the world. They might be due to toxins in the environment that can be, heavy metal toxins or organotoxins or mycotoxins. So we're looking at this dance of who we are in relationship to our environment, and seeing how that environment bathes over our genes, our unique genetic nature. And so we're bringing all of these things into account and then listening to the story of someone's life to be able to begin to dissect, well, what are the predisposing factors that you have, like your genetic predisposition or your family upbringing? What are the triggers? What are the things that tipped you over that were precipitating factors when you started to have imbalance and illness going on? And then what are the perpetuating factors, the mediators that continue that imbalance to occur? If you have a disease or an imbalance that's got an inflammatory nature and you're eating foods that are inflammatory, or you're in relationships that are inflammatory, or you're exposed to toxins that are inflammatory, all of those things are going to perpetuate that imbalance. So in functional medicine, we take this systems-based view, this systems biology view, that is integrating these elements and listening to the person and personalizing the treatments. Now, the treatments are personalized and they can use drugs, but oftentimes we don't need them. We can use food, we can use nutraceuticals, we can use ways to be able to balance the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And so we're working to try to help the person find balance and move into a way where that naturally decreases their symptoms. We're working to have the healthiest person possible. And so the focus is really on the person and on health rather than on eradication of illness. We find in the Western model, we have antihypertensives, antidepressants, antibiotics, all of these things that are meant to suppress the symptoms that are there. And when they get rid of the symptoms, the perception is that the disease is gone, but it's not. We haven't actually changed the landscape of the person. We've just worked to suppress the symptoms. That's insufficient for us to move towards health and well-being. It helps the person feel better in the moment. But we find, for example, there are things like proton pump inhibitors that help with what we call GERD, gastroesophageal reflux, and a burning pain that's here. And yet when we study those, they've been validated for 12 weeks period of time, but we've got patients who've been on them for 20 years and they have an effect. If you shut off the acid in the stomach, well, it's actually there for a reason. It helps the digestive process.
Yeah.
And if you shut that off and you don't have digestion working properly, it's going to have some downstream consequences, some long-term consequences. So that's an example of, how we approach things from a functional medicine perspective that's different.
So, really as one of the thought leaders in functional medicine, I'd love to hear a bit more about how it has evolved and what initially drew you to functional medicine.
Well, it's interesting to, in the career of being involved. When I was in medical school, I was very interested in all the different kinds of approaches. It wasn't like I wanted to do one thing. I thought every aspect of medicine was fascinating to me. And so whether it was in pediatrics or OBGYN or cardiology or neurology, and I began to look at and be open to the ideas of, well, how do we do what I called at the time clinical prevention? How do we help people to stay well? And, the public health ideas of doing that were interesting, but not sufficient to me. So I wanted to focus on how do we look at wellness? How do we look at using nutrition and the way in which we think and psychoneuroimmunology, use imagery, our dreams, all different kinds of tools to be able to help. And what I found was that most people aren't going to choose to optimize their wellness. They're going to turn to that after they start not feeling well. After they have some symptoms, they say, oh, maybe I'm not going in the right direction here. And that becomes the motivating factor for them to change their behavior. And so I began to learn about that. And it's fascinating to me because I have joked with some friends that, was focused on how to be able to help optimize function and wellness in an academic setting. And I was trying to do that and study how do we optimize that for people when I was in medical school and couldn't really understand within the systems how to do that. And so I became, a family doctor and became, focused more on prevention and wellness, but in the setting of taking care of sick people. But then I got the opportunity much later in my career to work at the Cleveland Clinic, and we set up the Center for Functional Medicine and got to do that exact kind of research. More about that later. So when I was in medical school, I remember reading about nutrition and biochemistry and saying, well, this makes perfect sense. What we eat is exactly what happens in biochemistry. The macronutrients and the micronutrients, how they work and interplay together. How fascinating. Oh, we actually understand this. But it wasn't applied in the clinical setting. And so we found that the nutrition in the hospitals was not very good. There wasn't an interest in other kinds of approaches. So my education was one where I continued to try to expand and learn other kinds of approaches. So I learned hands-on healing and chiropractic. I learned, Chinese medicine, very rudimentary, just like several hundred hours, but I was studying, the Ni Ching's, classic, the Yellow Emperor's classic of internal medicine, at that point in time to be able to understand. And I thought, how do these pieces all fit together? And what I found through the course of my career is that they fit together through this operating system that we call functional medicine. So we've had the opportunity to develop it and codify it and be able to train tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world to be able to use these tools to apply them so that we're using all of the different kinds of medicines that are available for people. As we'll talk about, we include drugs, we include, chemotherapy and radiation therapy if it's needed. We're working to have a truly holistic or inclusive approach to healing. And it's been just an incredible journey to be a part of that, in giving voice to that and sharing that with people.
What you said also about the prevention really resonates with me, and it reminds me of this verse in the Chinese Emperor Classic, and it says, trying to cure yourself when you're sick is like trying to dig a well when you're already thirsty. Another really interesting thing I would love to chat about is, so I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but you are an initiated Murakami, so a
Very good.
shaman. Great.
Well, shaman is a Siberian word for their traditional healers. So we've just sort of taken that and applied that. But with the Huichol, the Huirarica people who live in the Sierra Madres in Mexico, I was I'll say called to work with them. And it's fascinating because I was never really interested in that. And I started having dreams, and I talked with a teacher about that. And he said, oh, well, this relates to this kind of work. And so I went on a vision quest, and in the vision quest, I knew it was very clear what I had to do, during days of 5 days of fasting and meditating and reflecting. And it just became very clear that, I need to understand this approach to healing, one that uses the connection to the natural world and really emphasizes the deep aspect of listening and connecting to that which is unseen, being able to listen more deeply. And so that has become part of what I do and part of my approach with people who are interested in that, in addition to functional medicine. So that aspect of being a traditional healer is just opening up my mind and opening up my heart to things that my Western view have kind of limited. And I can talk more about that, but for me in practice, what that means is, it's necessary for me to quiet my mind and to be able to listen in a way that allows me to some might call it intuition. It's not really intuition. When I'm sitting with someone and I'm starting to feel a lot of anger inside me, and it's like, I didn't have anger when we sat down. It's like, what's happening in the field in this relationship, and how do I bring that forward and help the person who I'm with, to be able to bring that forward in a way that's conscious instead of unconscious, and then work with that energy, if you will, to be able to help the person move through it. So those are aspects of this journey that is, it's referred to in our culture as shamanism, but shamanism really is a term that has been very much misused. And people think that, oh, I can just go on a journey and then I'm a shaman. So for myself, this is something that is a daily practice. This is something that is, going to specific places and connecting to them and deepening my relationship, and doing this, for now, 19 years. And it's not something that is like, as they say in the US sometimes, one and done. I did that, been there, done that. It is about deepening the relationship to the world around us, so that I can better hear and be of better support to the people that I'm working with.
So you had these dreams of the Ouija people before ever meeting them and ever going there?
It was of places, not people. I guess it was of people as well, but it was sort of signaling that this is something that just felt very, very important to me. And I've continued to work with dreams with a close friend, actually, who is also, in addition to being a Murakami, he's a Jungian analyst, and I look at my dreams and help use them to guide me to understand what the steps are that I need to take in the world. So when I'm listening to the dream world, it's a part of our world also, and being able to consider that everything in my dreams is related to my life. And so all the projections that I have of all the different characters, I'm considering, what's that part of me, and what is this dream, teaching me about what I need to listen to and how I need to move.
I would love to ask a bit more. What is the role of a shaman? I think sometimes there can be a lot of misconception, and today there's a lot of association with, for example, ayahuasca ceremonies and so forth. So I would love to understand a bit more about what is the role of a shaman.
Well, a shaman is a guide. It's someone who is walking along the path of your life, of healing with you, to be able to help you on that journey. So that can be, there's certainly, doctors have played that role in the past in other cultures. There's sort of the role of the healer as priest, and the healer as fixer. And really both of those are aspects. Doctor comes from the Latin docere, to teach, and so it's working to help teach someone. The shaman, the spiritual guide, is someone who's helping you to be able to connect to, well, what is your meaning and purpose in your life, and how are you connected to that, and being able to work with you. And so that's really, I said early on, when in talking about functional medicine, we're also connecting to the relationships and the meaning and purpose for that person's life. How do they move in a way that is connected to meaning and purpose? And when people have that, they're able to be healthier. They have an integrated view of their life in relationship to the world. And so the choices that they make are based upon where they're going, and their purpose is. And so they feel enlivened and they feel energized to be able to bring that to the world. And we find these people all over the place who are bringing their gifts forward in incredibly beautiful ways, and so we sit in a time of a pandemic and people are like, oh, what's going on with our world? And yet we're seeing these new ways of being able to relate to each other, to connect to each other, to bring ideas forward that haven't existed before. So it's like the resilience of the human spirit and the ability to be able to find ways to be able to connect and relate are just amazing. So that's to me, that's part of what this journey of the shaman is in working with someone. And I work with, not just the physical aspects of what's going on, but really the emotions, how we play in the world. So, those emotions that relate to happiness, compassion, sadness, grief, fear, anger. There's just a dance of those emotions that are happening all the time within us. And so how do we work with allowing that dance to occur? When we look at a 3-year-old child, we see him move through these emotions really quickly, but not be attached to them. But unfortunately, as adults, we tend to become either attached or averse to particular emotions. Oh, anger. I'm never going to be angry. Well, if someone does something to you that crosses your boundaries and creates conflict, then standing up and holding that boundary, which is an expression of anger, that's a necessary thing to do. Don't not do it. Just like don't not cry. If you have something that's grieving, a dear friend, a family member dies, grieving and offering sadness is actually an acknowledgement of how much that person touched you in your life. That's a good thing. It's important to do that. So these are some of the kind of approaches as a Murakami, and then as a physician, it's like, well, those are important things to consider as well, because those may be limiting factors that allow someone to move back towards wellness, back towards balance.
Yeah. And there's actually a question that I wanted to ask on emotions later on. But before I ask that, one point I wanted to share was that when I previously once did past life regression, actually one of the visions that came through to me was being a shaman in Mexico. So I never really got much of an interpretation of that. But I think it was interesting because at that time I'd never been to Mexico. When I did visit Mexico a few years ago, it was quite interesting. And I haven't really shared this much either, but I had like a little mark come up on my hand and no idea what it was, but then it went away after a few weeks.
Where did you go?
So I went to Tulum.
Well, you may have some connection there. It's like there's different, if you will, acupuncture points in the world and different energetic places that we connect to and resonate with. And they bring up certain energies, for each of us as individuals. So that's, like listening to that, like there's something there. You don't have to figure out what it is right now, but holding that in the space of like, there's something that emerged and it relates to a dream that I had, and being able to hold that and seeing, as I said, what I was doing in medical school, felt really important and I couldn't move with it. And then, there I am, 32 years later doing it, it's like, so hold that, Scarlett, and know that there's some meaning there that is yet to be revealed.
Definitely will. I'll come back to you 20 years later on that. So before we move on, I guess, to the point where I wanted to talk a bit more about the emotions and TCM, it'd be great to now talk a bit more about TCM. So I read that you studied acupuncture early on in your career. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about when you would use certain TCM modalities in your own practice.
I mentioned that while I was in medical school, I had an opportunity to be able to study more from an internal medicine standpoint, and then using an electroacupuncture. I never learned needling technique at that point in time. But my teacher at the end of that time, he said, if you want to use this, you need to go to school to be able to really understand the perspective. And I looked at him and as though, well, I've studied here. Can't I use this? He said, well, if there are, people who are learning TCM in China and they take 100 hours or 200 hours about Western medicine and infectious disease, would you go see them for those problems? I said, well, no, I'd want to see someone who really understood it more deeply. And he just he winked at me and said, yeah, you understand. And I thought that I would go to study acupuncture more deeply. It's not how my career unfolded. But what did unfold was an opportunity to be able to learn about the 5-element perspective of traditional Chinese medicine, of studying that much more deeply, for several years through a tool called plant spirit medicine, where it's around a tool that is using the diagnostic approach of 5-element Chinese medicine and doing pulse taking in that way and understanding the imbalances, working with the meridians, but then not using acupuncture per se, but using plants and using the plant spirits that I journey to be able to help move the energetics through the meridians.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that, and I was frankly a bit skeptical of that from a teacher, Elliot Cowan. But I found, wow, it works. And so, that was part of my deepening into, recognizing the value of the Shen cycle and the Ko cycle in 5 elements, as there has the movement, from fire to earth to metal to water to wood, and how those actually support and also can transform each other and the interactions that go on there. And now we get into maybe a bit more of my crazy way of thinking is that, those 5 elements also relate to the mandala, and they relate to the fire being in the center and the fire of transformation, which is very much a shamanic view, that there's the 4 directions and the fire in the middle. And that is another example of the 5 elements at play. And what we see, and what I see in functional medicine, is that there's the interplay that's going on, that the fire, like the immune system and the inflammation, relates to the gut, the aspect of earth, our gut, and what's going on with our gut microbiome are a manifestation of what our connection to the world is, what we eat, what we breathe, what we touch, and that relates to and connects to the air that we breathe and what's happening in that view. And that connects to the water, and the sense of fear and awe in our presence. And that connects to the wood, which is around boundary setting, flexibility, but also, it can be anger as well. So each of these elements emotionally relate to the different aspects. So flow is going to be about transportation and communication. Metal is going to be about detoxification and energy production. Earth is going to be about the gut. Fire is going to be about the immune system, and wood is going to be about the infrastructure. So now I've just recreated the what we call the matrix of functional medicine within the view of these 5 elements. It's a way of being able to understand, if people have been talking about these, whether it's in TCM or different perspectives, but similar qualities in Ayurveda for 5,000 years, maybe there's something here. Maybe there's something in this view that we can listen to and understand what the patterns are of flow and of movement.
Kind of expanding on this idea that all disease begins in the gut. And as you mentioned, gut health before, I'd love to start talking a bit more about why our microbiome is so important. And if you always begin by looking at the gut health of your patients.
So you just heard me, speak to the aspect of of earth
Mm.
and what we take in.
Yeah.
And so, we use these terms, we use these medical terms, macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbs, and when we study biochemistry, it's like, oh, well, those are the inputs into the Krebs cycle. And we need to have nutrients, the vitamins and minerals to be able to help that metabolism process to occur.
Yeah.
But where do we get those from? Well, that's our food that we're eating, so what is our relationship to the food that we're eating? And do we have food that is nourishing and giving us all of those elements that are necessary? When we do, we then have balance in the microbiome in our gut, that is diverse and rich, and it performs many metabolic functions as well. We're not alone. People used to, the 10 years ago, we thought that 90% of the cells in our body are bacterial. And we realize now it's probably about 50-50. About half of the cells in our body are bacterial, on the order of 10 to 30 trillion cells. And we have about 10 to 30 trillion cells that are us. Now, so when we look at that, we recognize, oh, we're in relationship to the world, and it's actually also manifesting itself inside us. So it has been, studied that the most complex ecosystem that we've ever studied as humans is the gut microbiome. And so there's a lot of things that are going on, and we need it to be in balance in order to help our health and well-being. And so recognizing that there's this interrelationship with the world around us and the world within us, the microbiome. So the microbiome of the world and the microbiome in our gut are actually related to each other. You can say that, and it's, some people look kind of confused, and other people say, well, that makes a lot of sense, that the interrelationship of, what I see is, the depletion of the microbiome, of the diversity of life in the world, is similar to the loss of the diversity that's happening within the human gut microbiome. And that loss of diversity means loss of function. So how do we bring that back into balance? So from the perspective then of, seeing an individual who's coming in, who's got an imbalance, who's got an autoimmune disease or cancer or diabetes or heart disease or, a mood disorder or loss of cognition, each of these things, one of the first things I'm considering with that individual is like, well, what's going on with their ability to receive the nutrients that they need? And early on in my career, in focusing on this, which is really not different than, Ayurveda or Persian medicine or traditional Chinese medicine or naturopathic medicine, all of them hold these principles. And when we go back to, study Paracelsus and Galen and Maimonides and Hippocrates, they're all talking about, the role of the gut as this interface that's going on. So I consider that. Now, I probably don't do it 100% of the time, but I do it 90% of the time, where there's a focus on, well, let's get some understanding of what's going on with the gut to find balance there. Are you able to digest and absorb your foods? Is there permeability or leakiness in that infrastructure? What's happening with the immune system? 2/3 to 3/4 of it, which sits in the lining of the gut. What's happening with the microbiome in balance overall? And then what's happening in that gut-brain connection? Because literally how we feel is related to the gut microbiome and the balance of what's happening there. The inputs of thinking of it as a sensory organ, it is actually informing our view of what our feelings are, coming back to the emotions. And so, yeah, I want to focus on the gut and want to focus on, well, what are the foods that can be used that will help to bring balance to the gut? And when I do this, in earlier on in my career, I would use lots of probiotics to try to, let's say, push an agenda. Now I look at probiotics more like I look at antibiotic. Probiotics can be used to drive specific kinds of actions in the microbiome, but they come in as tourists and they have an effect on the gut while they're there. But they do not stick around. They're there temporarily. And so we can look to, Shanghai or Guangzhou or Beijing or Sydney and say, well, there's an effect when there's tourists, and certainly, in this time of the pandemic, when there's no tourists, it's affected some cities really greatly because they haven't had that influx. But we don't want to be reliant on tourists. We don't want to be reliant on probiotics. We want to be able to provide the foods that are going to help the balance of the microbiome within the gut microbiome to be able to have a richness and diversity that allows it to perform all the functions that are necessary. Avoiding, it's about a balance between those things. And within the functional medicine view, I'm not sure if I'll say often or usually focus on the gut first to be able to help the person to move along on a path of healing.
So I wanted to ask about antibiotics. And so we know that antibiotics can, really wreak havoc on our microbiome. But I wanted to understand a bit more, in what circumstances would you recommend taking them? And what's the protocol for recovery once you do take antibiotics?
Well, the second aspect about what is the protocol for recovery is actually becoming more controversial.
Okay.
We thought we knew, and it's not quite as simple as we thought. But first, and as I've said, within the functional medicine framework and with any kind of holistic framework, there are times where the tools that we have, like antibiotics, can be useful. It's just that we find that they're overused. Maybe 10-fold too much, and they're being used in, raising animals to be able to help increase the weight and the fat content of animals. And so we also get antibiotics not only prescribed, but through many of the foods that we eat. In fact, 85% of the antibiotics used in the world right now are used on animals to be able to help them grow, which, may be problematic, which is why we talk about, eating organic foods or eating, if we're going to eat animal products, eating animal products that are organic and that haven't been exposed to those antibiotics. Then in terms of clinical practice, I find a lot of infectious disease may be viral in origin. And, when someone has a fever, we don't assume that it's related to a bacterial illness. When we look and we see, how does that person move with their immune system, and can they, over a couple days to a week, be able to take care of it by supporting their immune system? If they can't, if they have continued problems, or if they deteriorate, that's the time when antibiotics are to be used. But when we see our children have ear infections, most ear infections are caused by viruses. We wouldn't give an antibiotic for that. So there are times when it is necessary. And when it is necessary, use them, and using antibiotics that are specifically targeted to where the problem is. When we use what are called broad spectrum antibiotics, well, those will tend to have a broader effect on wiping out the gut microbiome. And when we use a specific antibiotic, then that can be used to be able to target where the imbalance is or where the infection is and treat it. And so that's the first part. Now, when we use antibiotics, I always recommend that we use, something that goes along with it as a probiotic. And interestingly, this probiotic is not a bacteria. Most probiotics are other bacteria. This probiotic is a yeast. It's made from brewer's yeast. It's called Saccharomyces boulardii. Boulardii is the strain. Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain boulardii, which was developed in France in the late 1800s. And we've shown that this can help to prevent an antibiotic-associated diarrhea. It can help to prevent an antibiotic-associated infection called Clostridium difficile. And so whenever I'm giving antibiotics, I'm recommending this at the same time to be able to help. Now, it goes to the second part of your question, then what is the way to bring to help afterwards? And, we have learned that using probiotics to help bring balance back to the system can be helpful. But more recent work by some of the premier microbiome researchers at the Weizmann Institute in Israel, Aran Segal, and his team have demonstrated that probiotics afterwards may actually delay the recovery of the normal flora for an individual. So that's raised questions about that. And for me, it's actually led to a change in my clinical practice over the past few years, where I'll use the probiotic that I mentioned, Saccharomyces boulardii, when I'm giving antibiotics. But after that, my focus is on prebiotics. That is, those elements that are going to help to feed the beneficial bacteria in the gut. And there are different prebiotics that are available, and we're still early in our learning curve to know exactly which prebiotics are best for which individual at which point in time. So there's a bit more of an empiric approach with that. But using some of the newer tools that I mentioned of the census taking of the gut microbiome called metagenomic sequencing, where they use shotgun sequencing and can tell the 300 plus different species that are present in you or in me, and they're different from each other. I like to say that the biodiversity in our gut, it's different in Paris than it is in New York, than it is in Hong Kong, than it is in Cape Town.
Actually, I wanted to ask, so I've heard you mention that even people living in the same city, the ones who go to the park have a different microbiome than those who don't.
Absolutely. And the ones who live inside and don't go outside, the ones who go outside, the ones who go to the park, and then the ones who go out to, out into the natural world, they have different microbiota. And the microbiota become more and more diverse the more we engage the natural world. And the Finnish have done, people in Finland the researchers have done a great job of being able to show this. And it's true not only for the skin for the microbiome in our gut, it's also true for the microbiome on our skin. And so we can see a change in actual disease, in atopic illnesses and eczema. We can see a change in GI illnesses that happen. There's a term that's been developed by one of the researchers, Alan Logan, and his partner Susan Prescott in Australia, called global dysbiosis, and talking about really the overall imbalance that we have going on because of the loss of diversity in the natural world as well. An interesting side note, but it relates back to our earlier conversation, and that is that the indigenous people represent 5% of the people on the planet. They steward 20% of the land on the planet. That land holds 80% of the biodiversity of the planet. Now, that's pretty fascinating to think about in terms of when we are in right relationship with the natural world, that it promotes more diversity, and that promotes more diversity in our microbiomes and helps to optimize function. And so the interrelationship of us and the natural world is not conceptual. It's really quite practical.
Later, I guess, in our conversation, we'll come back a bit more in terms of this idea and the importance of reconnecting with nature. But I wanted to also ask a bit more about psychobiotics. So what is this idea of psychobiotics, and how is it that we can look at the gut to begin treating things such as mood, depression, anxiety?
So I mentioned the concept of how we feel, and that there's a interrelationship between what is termed now as the gut-brain microbiome axis. I think that's actually a little bit misnomer, because it's really about the gut microbiome /brain axis, the interrelationship that goes on. So what we find is that 10 times more information comes from your gut up to your brain than from your brain to your gut. And where it goes in your brain, an area called the insular cortex, a part of the cortex that is around analysis, is it's giving the metabolites from the bacteria that are present. It's coming from the hormones that are generated. It's coming from the inflammatory cytokines. It's coming from the nervous connections, all within the gut. So our brain is kind of getting constant input about what's going on. And the terminology in English that we use, things like gut feelings, or, what's going on in my gut, or I'm feeling like, there's something that I'm feeling, and we often will, when we say feeling, we'll hold our stomach or our abdomen, because that is a driver. So that information goes in to the brain, and it connects to our centers of memory and emotion. And it's from there that it drives what's happening hormonally, what's happening with the stimulation of our vagus nerve, what's happening with the activation of our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, how we're expressing emotions in the world. Those things are connected to each other. Thus, the idea is we can begin to recognize, well, what are components like probiotics that can shift that balance and be able to change mood. And so researchers out of the APC in Cork, Ted Dinan, and I'm forgetting his compatriot's name, have been talking about the idea of psychobiotics, and that is psychologically acting probiotics. Those probiotics that are specifically being given that can show an effect on how we deal with stress, what our mood is, are we depressed, how anxious we are. And so research has been done, first in mice and now in humans, that demonstrates specific probiotic strains that will be able to affect anxiety, that will be able to affect depression, that will be able to affect how we deal with stress. And those have been labeled as psychobiotics. Now, I said earlier that probiotics, can be used to be targeted for specific disease states like antibiotics. It's not about, just take a little sprinkling of probiotic pixie dust and you're going to be okay. Rather, it's about a targeted approach. So I favor the targeted approach as we deepen our understanding of psychobiotics, and then also go to say, and what are the foods that are going to help those bacteria to grow as part of our normal environment in our gut? And what are the prebiotics that can be taken that are going to help that, so that we're achieving balance through a food first approach rather than a medicine first approach.
So what are your most commonly recommended prebiotics?
Well, so when I'm looking at prebiotics, I'm thinking about foods. I'm thinking about chicory and things with inulin and artichoke, Jerusalem artichoke, and garlic and onion and those kinds of things. Some people can tolerate them, some people can't. I'll also use prebiotics that are if you will, powders off the shelf, where I'll use acacia root powder. It's very effective. I'll use things that are garabinolactones. I'll use fructooligosaccharides. I'll use inulin. I'll use modified citrus pectin. And at this point, Scarlett, I'm really working to empirically try different things with people to see what brings balance to them. I don't yet have a handbook that says, if you have this problem, this is the prebiotic to take, which is why when I can, I'll use, a promoting a broad variety of vegetables. What I used to say was, I'd like someone to take 9 portions of fruits and vegetables a day. And when you look down at your plate each day, and I still do, when you look down at your plate each day, at least once you should see 5 colors of different kinds of vegetables that are there. Eat the rainbow. Exactly. It's easy to think that way. But in more recently, I've begun to recognize and realize from my own patterns is that the rainbow of fruits and vegetables, especially vegetables that I eat, is rather limited. It's the same 5 or 8 different vegetables. And if I look in my refrigerator each week, There's about 10 different vegetables. There's a lot of them, but there's about 10 different vegetables. And the idea now that I'm working with, that I was posed to me and it made a lot of sense, is trying to help people to eat 30 different kinds of vegetables every week. Now that is diverse, and begins to open up the palate. So it adds nuance to the rainbow, if you will.
I like
But the
that.
whole goal is about adding diversity to the gut. And then there are some people, who some of those kinds of vegetables and some of those kinds of prebiotics or some of those kinds of fermented foods, they're not going to be able to tolerate. They're going to have bloating. They're going to have issues that occur. And so that's an indication that there's an imbalance and you don't want to eat those foods at that point in time.
Yeah.
But you do want to be able to then say, well, what is the imbalance that's occurring here? Do I have some bacterial overgrowth? Do I have some maldigestion? Do I have some other factor that is affecting motility because I'm stressed all the time and my gut motility is impacted by that? You need to understand when you're having those symptoms of constipation or diarrhea or bloating or abdominal pain. Those are signals that there's an underlying imbalance that needs to be addressed.
I wanted to also ask about H. pylori. And so this is something that is quite common. I was wondering from your perspective, what is your treatment protocol for that? Because generally it's antibiotics, and it's the proton inhibitor that you mentioned as well.
Well, I have a different perspective on H. pylori than many of my medical colleagues. And when we look at indigenous peoples around the world, they all have H. pylori. It's a common bacteria that is part of the gut microbiome. It's a part of the gastric microbiome of the stomach itself. The microbiome changes between the stomach and the top of the small intestine and the bottom of the small intestine and the colon. Very different numbers, very different distributions of bacteria that are there. So H. pylori is quite common. Early on in my practice, I worked with on the Bering Sea with the Yupik Eskimo people, and we found because there was blood in their stools, we tried to investigate, and we found that when we measured, 56 out of 57 people had H. pylori, and that's what the bleeding was from. And we treated them and we eradicated it. And a year later, it came back. Now, they did not have any problems with peptic ulcer disease. And certainly the work of Barry Marshall, who did the work and won the Nobel Prize for medicine on H. pylori inducing ulcers, it's within a certain context. It doesn't automatically induce ulcers in everyone. And there are some specific substrains of H. pylori that may be more problematic that we can look at and treat. But in general, unless someone has an ulcer and H. pylori, I don't treat H. pylori. So when it's seen, I say, okay, well, they have that. We need to just pay attention, make sure they don't have, develop any kind of GI bleeding. But in general, I'm not trying to eradicate it. I consider it to be part of the normal flora in the upper gut. And I was encouraged that, one of the leaders, gastroenterologists, who's Dr. Martin Blazer from New York, has written a book in 2014 called Missing Microbes. And he says exactly the same thing that I do. I'm like, okay, I'm not crazy. Here's another worldwide expert who feels like, yeah, we don't need to overdo it, because the effect of the aggressive antibiotics, triple antibiotic therapy and things like that, is kind of like dropping a nuclear bomb in the gut. And then you're going to have to, rebuild the whole thing. The proton pump inhibitors that are given in those treatments are not so bad because they're just used for a very limited period of time. Proton pump inhibitors can be useful, for a 8 to 12 week treatment. They're just not good for long-term treatment.
So what are your thoughts on using things like mastic gum to reduce the population?
I have used it early on in my career, and in considering that, I never really felt it make a big difference in the symptoms for people at that point in time. So I'm not against it, but I don't generally use it because I haven't found it to be effective.
Okay, perfect. So, of course, being the chief medical officer at Genova Diagnostics, it would be remiss for me to not ask what stool tests you find to be the most accurate and the difference in the sequencing and why it matters.
Stool testing is interesting and has evolved over the past 40 years, 45 years since it kind of first came in around 1985. At that point in time, we focused on doing culture, which, culture is just the aerobic and facultative aerobic organisms that constitute about 1% of the bacteria of the gut. So you're really getting a rather limited survey of what's happening there. That's what we had. And we also had some biomarkers that could tell us about the metabolites of what was going on in the gut. Those things called short-chain fatty acids, and which are still used today, which I find to be incredibly helpful. And even in current research, is something that tells us about, I like to say, the coin of the realm, like what is the economy? Well, we can tell by looking at the short-chain fatty acids of what's happening there. So that's continued on. In the early 2000s, we brought new markers that helped us to look at inflammation and digestion, in being able to do that, calprotectin and pancreatic elastase. Then we saw the emergence of what are called the 16S RNA probes, where there's essentially a signature that there's a particular protein in bacteria that is the ribosomal subunit, that it varies from bacteria to bacteria. And so we can use that as a signature and be able to quantify, some of the species that are there. Various tests have used 24, 32, 50 different probes to be able to get an assessment of that. And then we've seen over the past several years an emergence of what I've mentioned as metagenomic sequencing that really looks at everything that's there. So what I prefer when I do testing is I prefer a combination of things. And talked with my, colleague, Jason Horlack, who in Tasmania, who has the Probiotic Advisor, who has a very similar view. And that is, looking at the metagenomic sequencing that allows us to be able to see the full census of what's happening. That's important to take rather than using just a few probes. If we're looking at, 24 or 50 probes, and there's several thousand different organisms that are in each of our guts, we're again only getting a small portion of what's going on. So in doing that, so we've got 5% instead of 1% maybe. But the other testing that has been done in the past that looks at markers of inflammation, of digestion, of the short-chain fatty acids are also particularly important. You really need both to be able to get a picture of what's going on. If you're going to do stool testing, to be able to functionally assess the gut, so we see like who's living there and what's happening, and that is using the biomarkers, that are available from several different companies. I continue to use the testing from Genova Diagnostics because I know that it's reliable and reproducible. And although I don't have any intrinsic relationship back with that lab anymore.
So for people who feel generally healthy, would you recommend to also get stool testing done?
That's an interesting question, and it really depends upon where someone is looking to go. If people have issues of fatigue, of autoimmunity, of mood problems, depression, anxiety, those kinds of things, then I think that doing a stool test is a great idea, as well as if you have any gut symptoms that are going on. Then a stool test to be able to get a understanding of where that imbalance is arising from is a great idea. If you're, an athlete working towards optimal wellness, I think that there's ways to be able to work with foods and nutrients and prebiotics to be able to help support your gut without having to do further testing to be able to evaluate it.
Sounds good. Do you have any personal favorite books on health or in general that you like to give or recommend to people?
It's funny that you asked that. There's a colleague of mine, Elson Haas, who I first read his book when I was in medical school. And he's since become a good friend. And it's a classic book from the late 70s called Eating Healthy with the Seasons. And, it's about food and how to listen to the cycles of life and eating in right relationship to them. And that's a great, simple book. Another book that, I've recommended so many times, but I like to, and I used to give to people that I haven't recently, is Michael Pollan's book called Food Rules, which is 64 little one paragraph snippets about food and diet that have so many truths in them that are just, okay, if I could live from this place in right relationship with food and the world, then that would be a good thing. So those are the two books today that come to mind. You can see, and your viewers can't, but you can see behind me there's many books that are around, and that I continue to learn and deepen. Books about cancer and healing, books about life. I mentioned Plant Spirit Medicine, which is a book that's really about a very different view of the world and about healing. So I think that those are some of my favorites.
Perfect. And I will link these all in the show notes as well. So I wanted to kind of now segue into immune resilience and recovery in the time of COVID. And I think it's important to mention that you're also currently leading the COVID-19 task force at IFM and really doing really important work at the moment. And so from a functional medicine perspective, what can we do to protect ourselves better? You hear about things such as the long hauler syndrome that I think the number is 2/3 people experience certain symptoms after, such as fatigue, brain fog. It'd be really great to hear about your perspective and your advice.
One of the things that we find, with the emergence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the infection that's occurred, is that it's had an impact, and many people have said, oh well, there's nothing that can be done, and yet there is so much that can be done to be able to support our immune system so that it is actually resilient and that is able to deal with strongly meeting what's happening. So what occurred with the Institute for Functional Medicine was in March of last year, right about a year ago, we began to investigate and say, well, let's look at what we know about the immune system and what we know about viruses. And let's begin to evaluate everything that's out there of what has been investigated in the past with the initial SARS virus, the MERS virus, with coronaviruses, with how the immune system works. And we said, well, let's look at the mechanisms of action and be able to put together, how do we help the immune system? How do we support that in the process? What are the elements that are going to be there? And what we found was, well, there's lifestyle factors. And so we published a paper, Deanna Minnick and I published a paper on the lifestyle factors and the foods that will help to support the immune system and immune resilience. And it's not rocket science. Of course, it's going to be eating whole foods and moving away from processed foods and don't increase the sugar intake, really limit that, and have a rainbow diversity of vegetables that are involved to help support the microbiome. Then there's specific components that could be helpful. So looking at zinc and its role in being able to support the immune system, the role of vitamin D and its role, the role of vitamin C, of vitamin A, of quercetin, which acts as an anti-inflammatory. It's a potent bioflavonoid that also promotes viral inactivation. So it has an antiviral quality to it, and then other components as well, including N-acetylcysteine and melatonin. So we put this out and published it in the beginning of April, and using specific criteria to be able to use that, and have had that be available to help immune resilience all along. Now, while people have said, well, we don't really have anything we can do, our experience has been that those things really help to support the immune system and decrease the severity of illness. They're not public health measures that prevent a SARS-CoV-2 infection from respiratory droplets, but they help the immune system to be able to deal with it if and when it arises. So we worked with all that. We put together a course called the 3R course, resistance, resilience, and recovery, in times of a pandemic, to be able to help highlight what could be done. And those are the things that we still say should be done, even as we're preparing to get vaccines. And we've done research now, and we have a dashboard that's available that gives people a big view of all of the vaccines that have gone through phase 3 trials and been approved, from Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech, from AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, the viral vector vaccines, and including Sputnik 5 or Sputnik V, and then future purified protein vaccines like the one from Novavax and GlaxoSmithKline. So we're working to educate people about vaccines and about answering questions and concerns, but really being a curated dashboard of information. So people who want to can go to ifm.org/COVID webinar and be able to have access to teachings and have access to the dashboard, which is updated on a regular basis. And so there's that role of working with COVID, but there's also a role that I want to say that is, different than the Institute for Functional Medicine, but that looks at COVID, SARS-CoV-2 really as a virus of fear of, it's created a lot of reactivity in our world. And how do we deal with the uncertainty of what is going to happen? If we went to even 1 year ago from today, no one would ever have guessed that the world would be shut down in the way that it has, and that the degree of movement, really differentially, very different in the United States and Western Europe than in Asia or in Africa, in terms of the progression of the infections and the severity of the infections, and what has happened to our way of relating to the economy. So I want to highlight this aspect of uncertainty, and that, from the bigger perspective, nothing is ever certain. That is how our life is as human beings. We can get a phone call and our life can change in a moment. I remember, getting the phone call that, my father had cancer, and how that changed his life and my life, or the phone call that I had cancer and how that changed my life and my view and my priorities and what I ate and how I moved in the world. So this concept of uncertainty is part of what we're seeing with the expression, the natural expression of this SARS-CoV-2 virus and how it's moving through the world. So how do we live in relationship to uncertainty and be able to find ways that we still connect to each other as human beings, care for each other, care for ourselves, and recognize, as has been seen even in this pandemic, the role of getting out in nature and seeing
how much of a beneficial effect that has on individuals, on relationships, and on the immune system.
If it's okay, I'd like to talk a bit more about your journey and your experience with stage 4 cancer and how you healed yourself using also functional medicine and your approach to it. It's also for people who don't know what stage 4 cancer is. Perhaps you could share a bit more about what that means.
So, is sort of the natural segue to the conversation of uncertainty.
Yeah.
In that, almost 4 years ago, I felt a lymph node on my neck, and it was hard, and it wasn't painful. And so, as a physician, I'm like, oh, that's not a good thing. Like if you get a sore throat, you have a lymph node that swells up from the infection and you touch it and it's kind of sore. That's a normal inflammatory immune response. This was not. I had it checked out. I was really scared. And the doctor biopsied it and said, it's nothing. There's, just pay attention to it. And so for the next year and a half, I did. And it never changed. But then I noticed that there was another lump a little bit farther down on my neck that was bigger and that was not tender. And I had it evaluated, and it was determined to be a cancer that was on my larynx, an aspect of my voice box, and that it had spread to lymph nodes on both sides of my neck. And so when cancer starts one place and then spreads to another, or spreads around in the body, that is kind of the definition of a stage 4 cancer. It's not isolated anymore. So stage 1 cancers are pretty early. Stage 2 cancers are localized. Stage 3 cancers are beginning to spread, and stage 4 cancers have clearly spread to other parts of the body. And so getting that diagnosis now about 2.5 years ago was one that was, it changed my life. There's different emotions come up even as I talk about it now, that I first had to come to terms with, do I want to live? Do I want to fight this? And it may seem like, well, of course, and yet there was a part that was like, wow, this is a big deal, and this is going to take a lot, and I'm going to need support. And I really needed to extend out to my family and my community and ask for support, not sort of superficially, but really like I was going to need help, and recognizing that, metaphorically, cancer in my voice box is like, well, it probably has something to do that I'm not bringing my voice in the world the way I need to. And so, I had to consider that as well. So I began a journey right then. And that journey, included, meeting with the oncologist and finding out what the current treatments were, and meeting with a radiation oncologist and getting evaluated and talking to doctors. Fortunately, I was able to talk to doctors from Israel and Johns Hopkins and the top cancer centers in the United States, and Cleveland Clinic where I'd worked. And, and pretty much everyone said, well, if you have stage 4 cancer, you should do X-ray therapy, which is the treatment of choice. And we shoot X-rays at it, a lot of X-rays. And we use chemotherapy to help promote, to make the X-ray therapy more effective. A colleague of mine in the integrative medicine field, I talked to him and his wife and realized, if they're shooting X-rays at my throat, I may not be able to eat. And so I'm going to have to get a feeding tube. And
then in, considering that and recognizing, knowing dietary aspects are important, and, choosing to do a ketogenic diet, probably not for the right reasons, but it so happened I learned later, and actually found I had the data at the time. I was just too overwhelmed to assimilate it, that ketogenic diets are particularly helpful for cancers that are getting radiation therapy. Not every cancer is going to be benefited from a ketogenic diet, but some are. Basically we're starving all the sugar, taking all the sugar away so the cancer cannot grow. Those were important aspects, as was acupuncture. But another aspect, and really critical aspect, was my work as a Markame, and going and receiving energetic healing, shamanic healing, traditional healing at the beginning of that time as well. That helped me to find balance, and that also helped me to really deeply ask my friends and colleagues for help, and help me to see where I'm stepping incorrectly in the world. And so it's a very humbling process. And in doing that and going through several months of pretty intense therapy, radiation therapy every day, but being able to be supported by my family and friends and community, allowed me to not have a lot of the severe side effects. I used special fasting protocols before chemotherapy developed by Dr. Walter Longo. And so there were, I did acupuncture. I did something called frequency specific microcurrent to help with the radiation effects. I used special lotions and honey from New Zealand and all kinds of things. I did, what I could, and I was still physically devastated by it, and it was very difficult for me, to a point of wondering again, do I really want to live? This is really hard. And I remember one day specifically just feeling like I have to get outside. It was February, it was rainy, it was cold. I live in the mountains in North Carolina. And I went out, and I didn't have very much energy to walk, to go for a hike or something like that. And I just went and I played in the creek. And what I found, I used the tool to evaluate heart rate variability, which is a measure of sympathetic and parasympathetic tone in stress response. And I found after doing that my heart rate variability improved significantly. It doubled. And I was like, well, the only thing I did different was I just was outside in nature, and just kind of, being like a 4-year-old kid, moving sticks and stones around in a creek and watching the water flow, and connecting, and hearing the animals that were out there and the birds that were out there at that point in time. And I found that the natural world also made an incredible difference. Now, I know from the Japanese data on forest bathing that, it increases the anti-cancer properties of the immune system, but I found that out afterwards. I sort of knew some of these things, but it was what the unfolding of the journey was for me to be able to deal with the uncertainty of, I don't know if I'm going to live or die through this process, but I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to listen, and I'm going to learn. And, that's what I've done. And, I still work on treatments, ongoing treatments to be able to help. I've got, no evidence of disease, at 2 years, about 4 months ago. And, I continue to work on that healing path. Yay. And I have to bring my awareness to my own health and well-being. And that ebbs and flows. Honestly, you'd think, okay, maybe I figured the lesson out and I got it. But, I found that when, for example, when I started working on the COVID task force, that I overworked and I didn't care for myself and I didn't spend time in nature and I didn't do my workouts and, I didn't pay attention. I was focused externally, and that's good for like short periods of time. But I have to find a way to be able to do it with balance of caring for myself as well. So, as you can see, there's still a lot of emotion in the sharing of it. And I'm glad to be able to share it. I think it's important. But it's not a cure. It's not beating cancer. It's not being heroic. It's just listening and moving in a way that is helping me to connect with my authentic self and my humility, or being humble about, my place in the world, and then helping others to be able to do this. It's an ongoing journey, and I've learned a ton, and interestingly, I'm now seeing more cancer patients in my practice, and it's not about trying to be the heroic cancer doctor. It's about, as I said before, helping to be a guide and helping to walk with people on their own journey and their different journeys.
I can't thank you enough for everything that you have shared with us today, Dr. Hanaway, and how generous you've been with sharing your story and wealth of knowledge. With everything that is happening around us today, I definitely agree that despite all the challenges, it's definitely been a time and personal opportunity to connect deeper with ourselves and with our environment, whether that's nature or, whatever speaks to us most at that particular time. And I think you've been an absolute epitome of resilience, and I've learned so much today, and so thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a great, deep, and interestingly beautiful conversation. So thank you for helping to guide that process.
Hi everyone, thanks for taking the time to listen today. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to subscribe, and you can find us at wellnessjourney.co.